Hello everyone, welcome to Horror Stories, and I'm here to share some chilling and mysterious tales with you. I know many of you often use this video to help you sleep and relax, but before we start, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to motivate me to create more content. Also, please introduce yourself, where you're from, and what time you're watching. Now, make yourself comfortable and relax. I've never been one to believe in ghosts or anything supernatural. My family and I, we're pretty practical people. We don't scare easily, and we definitely don't buy into things like haunted houses or curses. But what happened to us that summer? Well, it's something we still talk about, and none of us can quite explain it. It started as a simple family hiking trip. My dad had this idea that we needed to disconnect from all our screens for a weekend and get out into nature. My mom, my sister Chloe, and I went along with it because it actually sounded kind of nice, a chance to leave behind the noise of the city, the work emails, the endless TikTok scrolling. So we packed up and drove out to this state park about 3 hours away, a place that Dad had heard about from a coworker. It was supposed to be beautiful, with trails that ran along a big lake and views that stretched out forever. We set up camp near the entrance to one of the longer trails. It was late afternoon, and the sun was still bright, casting long, warm beams through the leaves. There was a light breeze, the kind that rustled the branches overhead in a way that just made you want to take a deep breath and forget everything else. We had a simple plan: hike the loop, which was supposed to take us about 4 or 5 hours, then come back to camp for dinner. The trail was beautiful at first, just like we'd heard. The air smelled clean, like pine needles and earth, and we were all in good spirits, laughing and talking as we made our way deeper into the woods. The sunlight filtered through the trees in patches, and the ground was covered in soft moss and old leaves. Chloe and I joked about how Dad kept consulting this old tattered map, even though the trail was clearly marked, and Mom just shook her head, smiling as we teased him. About an hour in, though, things started to change. The trail narrowed, and the trees grew closer together, their branches reaching across the path like skeletal arms. The air felt heavier somehow, cooler. There was this strange, almost unnatural quiet that fell over everything. We hadn't seen another hiker since we started, but now there were no sounds at all. No birds, no rustling from animals moving in the underbrush. Even the breeze seemed to have disappeared, leaving the air unnaturally still. I could tell that everyone else felt it too. Chloe, who usually couldn't stop talking, had gone quiet, her eyes darting around as if she was looking for something, anything, that could explain the change. Mom looked over at Dad, her brow furrowed, and I could see the same question in her eyes that was in my mind. Should we keep going? Dad, though, seemed determined. We're almost at the lake, I think, he said, pointing ahead, though none of us could see anything but more trees and more shadow. He smiled, trying to be reassuring, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Something about the way he kept glancing over his shoulder told me he felt it too, that creeping unease, like we weren't alone. We pressed on, and I tried to ignore the way the air seemed to grow colder with every step. It wasn't long before we reached a small clearing. It wasn't the lake, just a patch where the trees pulled back enough to let in some light. There was a large rock near the center, and it looked like a good place to rest, so we stopped. Dad pulled out some snacks, and we all sat down, trying to shake off the weird feeling. That's when we first heard it. This low, echoing noise, like something heavy falling, a dull thud that seemed to vibrate through the ground. It was distant, but it made my skin crawl. Chloe looked at me, her eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, my heart pounding a little faster. "Probably just a tree falling," Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. He glanced around, frowning, as if he was trying to figure out where the sound had come from. Or maybe a rock slide, somewhere near the lake. We tried to brush it off, but that noise, that thud, left a chill in the air that wouldn't go away. We finished our snacks quickly, none of us really talking, and started moving again, eager to get to the lake and then back to camp before it got too late. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The trail seemed narrower than before, almost like the trees were closing in on us. The light that had been filtering through was fading, even though it was still early afternoon. It wasn't just the sun dipping lower, it was like the shadows were growing, like they were creeping in from the sides of the path, swallowing up the light. And then came the smell. At first it was faint, just a hint of something rotten, something decaying. But as we walked, it got stronger. This sickly sweet stench that clung to the air made it hard to breathe without gagging. Chloe pinched her nose, her face scrunching up. "What is that?" she muttered. I didn't have an answer, and neither did Mom or Dad. We kept moving, faster now, the sense of urgency growing with every step. The sound of our footsteps on the dirt path seemed too loud, echoing off the trees around us. It felt like the forest was watching us, like there were eyes in the shadows, following us, waiting for something. Finally, we reached a point where we could see the lake through the trees. It was just up ahead, the water dark and still, reflecting the sky above. We stepped out onto the rocky shore, and for a moment I thought maybe we were okay, that maybe we'd just been freaking ourselves out for no reason. Then we heard it again, the thud. Louder this time, and closer. It echoed off the surface of the water, and I could feel the vibration through the ground beneath my feet. I turned, scanning the tree line, and that's when I saw them. Eyes. Just for a split second, I saw them, glowing, yellow eyes staring at us from the shadows of the trees. They were gone as soon as I blinked, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. My breath caught in my throat, and I grabbed Chloe's arm. "We need to go," I said, my voice trembling. Dad looked at me, confused. "What are you talking about?" "There's something out there," I insisted, my eyes darting back to the spot where I'd seen them. "I don't know what it is, but we need to leave. Now." Chloe didn't need convincing. She had always trusted my instincts, and the fear in my voice was enough to set her off. She grabbed Mom's hand, and without waiting for Dad to argue, we started back the way we had come. Dad followed, though I could tell he wasn't sure whether to believe me or if we were just letting our nerves get the better of us. But as we made our way back down the trail, it became clear that something was wrong. The woods were even darker now, the shadows thick and oppressive. The cold seemed to cling to us, biting through our jackets, and that smell, that awful smell, followed us no matter how far we walked. And then there was the sound, footsteps, soft and shuffling, coming from somewhere behind us. I didn't want to look back. I didn't want to see what was there. But I could hear it, hear whatever it was, getting closer, the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot. Mom and Chloe were ahead of me, Dad just behind, and I could see the fear on all their faces. We were walking faster now, almost running, and the footsteps behind us picked up speed too, keeping pace. Suddenly, Chloe stopped, her eyes wide with terror. "Look," she screamed, pointing up ahead. I followed her gaze, and my heart dropped. Hundreds, maybe thousands of bats erupted from the trees, dark shapes against the dim sky, their wings flapping in a chaotic frenzy. They poured out of the branches, swirling around us, the air filled with the rush of wings and the high-pitched screeching that echoed through the forest. And then, beneath the noise of the bats, there it was again, that heavy thud, closer now, like something huge had fallen in the woods just behind us. I turned, and in the dim light I saw it, this dark shape moving between the trees, massive and unnatural, shifting through the shadows as if it was a part of them. "Run!" Dad shouted, and we took off, sprinting down the trail, branches whipping against our arms and faces. The ground was uneven, and I could feel my feet slipping, stumbling over roots and rocks. Chloe was crying, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her along as fast as I could. The bats had scattered, disappearing into the dark sky, but that presence, whatever it was still behind us, still following. We burst out of the woods, the campsite finally in sight, and I felt a surge of hope, a desperate need to reach the safety of the car. We made it to the clearing, and Dad was already fumbling with the keys, his hands shaking as he tried to unlock the car door. The air was thick with panic. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, louder than anything else. Come on," Chloe cried, tears streaming down her face as she glanced over her shoulder towards the dark edge of the woods. I didn't want to look back, but I could feel it, feel that thing still out there, still watching us. The air seemed colder the closer it got, and that awful smell was still clinging to everything, that sickening, rotten odor that made it hard to even breathe. Finally, I heard the click of the locks, and Dad flung the door open. We practically threw ourselves inside, slamming the doors shut behind us. Dad scrambled into the driver's seat, and I saw his hand shaking as he tried to get the key into the ignition. I could barely catch my breath, my hands clutching at Chloe, trying to calm her down, while my own fear surged through me like a tidal wave. The engine roared to life, and Dad didn't waste a second. He threw the car into gear and floored it, the tires spinning for a moment in the loose dirt before catching and lurching us forward. We sped away from the campsite, the headlights slicing through the darkness as we hit the main trail that led out of the park. I looked back just once, just long enough to see the edge of the forest fading behind us. There was something there, just barely visible in the darkness. A tall, twisted shape standing at the edge of the woods, its eyes glowing faintly in the reflection of the taillights. My breath caught, and I tore my gaze away, not wanting to see more, not wanting to remember. We drove in silence for a long time. No one said anything. Chloe was huddled against me, her face buried in my shoulder, her body trembling. Mom kept glancing back at the woods, her face pale, her eyes wide, as if expecting that thing to follow us out onto the road. It wasn't until we were far enough away that we finally started to breathe normally again, the tension slowly easing out of the car. I could feel the adrenaline wearing off, leaving behind only exhaustion. Dad kept driving, not saying a word, his eyes locked on the road ahead. We didn't stop until we reached the next town, and even then, it took us a while to feel like we could step out of the car. We found a small diner that was open, a bright, warm place that seemed worlds away from the nightmare we had just escaped. We sat at a booth in the corner, and for a long time, no one said anything. The waitress came over, took our order, but even then, it felt like we were in a daze, like none of us could fully process what had happened. Finally, Dad cleared his throat, his voice rough. "I don't know what that was," he said, staring down at his coffee cup, "but I know I don't ever want to go back there." Mom nodded, her face still pale. "There was something in those woods," she whispered. "Something that wasn't natural." Chloe looked up at me, her eyes red from crying, her voice small. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked. "That thing in the woods?" I nodded, my mouth dry. "Yeah," I said. "I saw it. I don't know what it was, but it was watching us." We sat there for a while, trying to make sense of it all. But the truth was, there was no sense to be made. Whatever we had experienced, it wasn't something that could be explained away easily. It wasn't just an animal or a trick of the light. It was something else, something dark and old, something that lived in those woods, hidden away from the world. We finished our meal in silence, and then Dad paid the bill. We left the diner, the bright neon lights casting long shadows as we walked back to the car. I remember looking back one last time towards the direction of the forest and feeling that same chill run down my spine, that same sense that we were being watched. Even though we were miles away, I could still feel it, like an invisible thread connecting us to whatever had been there, watching us, following us. We never talked about it much after that. Every once in a while, Chloe would bring it up, late at night, when the house was quiet and the darkness seemed to press in close. She'd ask me if I thought it would ever find us, if it was still out there. And every time I'd tell her the same thing, that it was just a strange experience, something that was over now, something that couldn't hurt us anymore. But deep down I wasn't so sure. There was something about that presence, that feeling of being watched, that I couldn't shake. It stayed with me, lurking at the edges of my mind, a constant reminder that there are things out there, things we can't understand, things that don't want to be found. Sometimes late at night, I still think I hear it, that heavy thud, echoing through the darkness and the rustle of something moving through the shadows. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see them, those glowing eyes, staring out from the woods, waiting. You know, I've never really believed in those urban legends people always share about creepy gas stations in the middle of nowhere. I thought they were just stories, told to scare folks like me, folks who travel for fun, looking for an adventure. But what happened to me and my husband last summer has stuck with me in a way that no ghost story ever could. It felt so real, because it was real. Sometimes, I still wake up in the middle of the night with the vivid image of that gas station seared into my brain. It started as a fun road trip. My husband, Sam, and I were driving cross country, just the two of us. We were heading west, somewhere on the highways of Texas, making our way through those endless stretches of dry land. It was one of those long summer days where the sun just never seemed to set. The road was practically empty, just our little sedan and miles of straight, flat asphalt that seemed to stretch forever. The radio signal had cut out, and the only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the occasional howl of wind that rattled our windows. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon when we finally decided to stop. We'd been driving for hours, and there was this low, flickering neon sign that caught my eye, pointing towards a small gas station just off the highway. There wasn't much around, just a couple of old, faded buildings and that one beat-up gas station. The kind of place where you don't even see other cars, just the sagging awning over the pumps and a dusty lot where someone might have parked a long time ago. I nudged Sam and said, "We should stop here. I need to use the restroom, and we can get some snacks too." He nodded, looking as weary as I felt, and steered us into the lot. The station looked like it had seen better days. The paint was peeling off the side of the building, and the lights above the pumps kept flickering, casting long, eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. I got out of the car, stretching my legs as I glanced around. There was an odd quietness to the place. I remember noticing the wind had picked up, how it whipped through the dry weeds along the edges of the building, and how the only other movement was a moth fluttering around one of the lights, throwing its tiny silhouette against the wall. I felt a shiver, but I brushed it off. It was just an old gas station after all. Sam went to fill the tank, and I headed inside to find the bathroom. The air inside the station was stale, like it hadn't been properly ventilated in a long time. The place was cluttered with dusty shelves carrying old snacks and a couple of grimy refrigerators humming along, filled with expired drinks. The attendant, a grizzled man in his 50s wearing a stained cap, barely looked up from behind the counter. He gave me a quick, almost dismissive nod when I asked where the bathroom was. "Out back, around the corner," he said, pointing with a thumb while keeping his eyes glued to some ancient TV set behind the counter. So I went out the back door. I followed this narrow, dimly lit path, the kind that makes you feel closed in, even though you're technically outdoors. The bathroom was exactly what I expected, a grimy, one-stall affair, dimly lit by a single yellow bulb that buzzed overhead. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the air was damp and smelled faintly of mildew. I took a deep breath, trying not to think too much about what germs might be lurking in there, and pushed my way inside. I locked the door behind me, one of those flimsy sliding locks that never quite give you confidence. I could hear the wind whistling through some unseen crack, and a dull thud of what sounded like a loose pipe rattling against the wall. My hands shook a little as I washed them after. Maybe it was just the fatigue catching up to me, and then I heard it. It was the faintest shuffle, like a footstep just outside the door. At first I thought it might be Sam, maybe coming to find me, but there was something off. The sound was slow, deliberate. I held my breath and listened, straining my ears as my heart began to pound in my chest. There it was again, a scraping sound, like someone's shoe slowly dragging along the gravel right outside. I stood there, staring at the door. I knew I was just being paranoid. It was probably just the wind, or maybe a stray dog sniffing around. I unlocked the door and pushed it open, just a crack, enough to peek outside. There was a woman standing there. I'll never forget her face. Her eyes were wide, staring at me with this hollow, vacant look, her pupils dilated like she'd just seen something terrible. Her hair was a mess, long, tangled, clinging to her face as if she hadn't washed it in days. But it was her expression that got me. She had this twisted smile, her lips stretched in a way that seemed wrong, like it didn't belong on her face. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile you'd see on someone trying to hide something sinister. I stammered, excuse me," trying to step past her. She didn't move. She just stood there, blocking my way, her eyes never leaving mine. I felt my stomach churn, this wave of unease washing over me. I tried to inch the door closed again, but she suddenly leaned in closer, almost pressing her face to the opening. Her eyes bore into mine, and I could see something flicker behind them, something dark, like a madness barely being held back. "Are you okay?" I managed to croak out. My voice barely sounded like my own, shaky and weak. The woman didn't answer. She tilted her head, her grin widening, and then, just as suddenly, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness around the corner of the building. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My heart was pounding, my ears ringing from the tension. I pushed the door open fully and stepped out, glancing around. The path was empty, no sign of her anywhere. I hurried back to the front, my feet crunching against the gravel faster than I intended. My eyes darted around the parking lot, trying to spot Sam. He was still at the pump, but now he was standing by the car, staring towards me. He must have seen the look on my face because he called out, "Everything okay?" I tried to nod, to shake off the fear, but I could still feel that woman's eyes on me. I mumbled, "Yeah, just weird." I glanced back over my shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there again, watching me from the shadows. When I reached Sam, he frowned, clearly seeing the worry etched across my face. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low. "There was a woman back there," I said, glancing towards the back of the building again. "She was acting strange. I don't know, maybe she was just lost or something?" Sam's brow furrowed, and he scanned the empty lot. There wasn't anyone else around. He nodded, his expression growing serious. "Let's just get out of here," he said, and I agreed immediately. We got in the car, and Sam started the engine. I kept looking around as we pulled away, my eyes darting to every shadow, every dark corner. We drove out of the lot, and I thought that would be the end of it. Just a weird encounter, something we'd laugh about later. But as we pulled onto the highway, something in the rearview mirror caught my attention. The woman. She was standing at the edge of the lot, right where the gravel met the road. Her head was tilted again, her eyes still fixed on us, and even from that distance, I could see that awful, twisted smile. It was like she'd been waiting for us to leave, just to make sure I saw her one last time. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I shivered involuntarily. I tried to shake it off, telling myself she was just some drifter, someone who meant no harm. But as we drove further away, I couldn't shake that feeling. The feeling that she was still watching us, her eyes boring into the back of my head, that grin etched into my memory. Sam must have noticed how tense I was because he reached over, squeezing my hand gently. "Hey, we're okay now. She's just a weirdo, nothing more." He tried to smile, to reassure me, but I could see the tension in his eyes too. He didn't believe his own words. The rest of the drive that night was silent. The radio had completely cut out by then, and all I could hear was the wind howling outside, the wheels rolling across the empty highway. The further we drove, the darker it got, until there was nothing but the two headlights cutting a narrow path through the blackness. Every so often, I'd catch myself glancing at the side mirrors, half expecting to see that woman standing in the road behind us. We were completely exhausted by the time we reached the small motel, one of those places that looked like it had existed since the 70s and had never been updated. The kind of place with a flickering neon sign missing a few letters, and a night clerk who seemed like he'd been awake all night, just waiting for lost travelers like us. Sam didn't say much as we got our room key. The motel manager, a small man with sunken eyes and a voice barely louder than a whisper, handed us a rusted key attached to an old plastic keychain with the number 12 scribbled on it in faded ink. He didn't seem interested in conversation, and that was fine by me. The room was about what we expected, small, dimly lit, with a musty smell that hit me as soon as I stepped inside. There was an old TV sitting on a dresser, a bed with a creaky mattress, and curtains that hung heavy and dusty across the lone window. It wasn't much, but at that point, I would have slept anywhere. I sat down on the edge of the bed while Sam locked the door behind us. He tossed his bag onto the chair and looked at me, his eyes searching mine. I knew what he wanted to ask, but he held back. I think he was hoping that if we just didn't talk about it, it might fade away into nothingness, just a strange memory that would grow less unsettling with time. I managed a small smile, trying to ease the tension. "Let's just get some sleep, okay? It's been a long day," I said, my voice sounding more confident than I actually felt. Sam nodded, letting out a sigh of relief. He pulled back the covers, and we crawled into bed, still fully clothed. The mattress creaked loudly under our weight, and the springs dug into my back, but I was too tired to care. I closed my eyes, trying to let the exhaustion pull me under. But sleep didn't come easily. The room was too quiet, and my mind kept replaying that woman's face, her vacant eyes, the way her head tilted unnaturally as she stared at me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was just mentally unstable or high on something. But no matter how I tried to explain it, there was this gnawing fear deep inside of me, telling me that it was something more, something darker. It must have been around 2 a.m. when I finally started drifting off, slipping into that space between being awake and asleep. That's when I heard it, a faint, scratching sound. It was soft, barely noticeable at first. I thought maybe it was the wind against the window, but then it came again, more deliberate this time. It sounded like something scraping against wood, a long, slow scratch. I opened my eyes, my heart instantly pounding in my chest. I strained my ears, trying to figure out if it was real or if my tired mind was playing tricks on me. Next to me, Sam was asleep, his breathing slow and steady. I didn't want to wake him, not unless I was sure. There it was again, coming from the direction of the door. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. Slowly, I sat up in bed, my eyes darting towards the door. The room was dark, but there was a thin sliver of light coming from the hallway outside, casting a faint glow beneath the door. The scratching continued, now louder, more insistent. It was like something or someone was dragging their fingernails across the wood, just outside our room. I felt my stomach drop, a cold sweat breaking out across my skin. I swung my legs over the side of the bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet touching the cold floor. I glanced at Sam, still asleep, and then I looked back at the door. I stood up, my legs shaky, and took a slow step forward. My hands were trembling as I reached for the lamp on the nightstand. I switched it on, the sudden burst of light flooding the room, making me blink against the brightness. The scratching stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I took a deep breath, trying to convince myself to open the door, to just take a look, to see if there was anything out there. I took another step, my heart pounding in my ears, and that's when I heard it, a whisper. It was so soft, barely more than a breath against the door, but I heard it. My name. The voice was stretched out, drawn out in a way that made my blood run cold. It wasn't Sam's voice. It was hers, that woman from the gas station. I felt a jolt of terror, my hand freezing just inches from the doorknob. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as I fell against the bed. My eyes were glued to the door, my pulse racing. The light above me flickered, and I watched in horror as the door handle started to turn, slowly twisting, as if someone on the other side was trying to open it. I lunged towards Sam, shaking him awake. "Sam, wake up!" My voice came out in a strangled whisper, and his eyes shot open, confusion clouding his face as he tried to understand what was happening. The door handle stopped turning. Sam sat up quickly, looking at me and then towards the door. "What is it?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. "There's someone outside," I whispered, my voice cracking. I heard her." He stared at me for a second, and then, without hesitation, he got up and grabbed the chair from the corner of the room, wedging it under the doorknob. He turned back to me, his face pale. "Stay here," he said, and I could see the determination in his eyes, though there was fear there too. I nodded, too terrified to argue. He moved cautiously towards the door, pressing his ear against it, listening. There was nothing, no scratching, no whispering, just silence. He held his breath, then slowly peeked through the peephole. For a moment he didn't move, and I could see his entire body tense up. He took a step back, his face going even paler. "There's no one there," he said finally, his voice a shaky whisper. A mix of fear and confusion overwhelmed me. I knew what I had heard. It wasn't my imagination. It couldn't have been. But the look on Sam's face told me everything. He wanted to believe me, but the empty hallway said otherwise. We didn't sleep much after that. We kept the lamp on, the chair wedged firmly under the door. I stayed close to Sam, every creak of the building making me jump. We both sat there, wide-eyed, waiting for dawn, waiting for that first bit of sunlight that might chase away whatever it was that haunted us. When morning finally came, we packed up and left as quickly as we could. The motel manager barely looked at us as we handed in the key. I wanted to ask if he'd seen anything, if anyone had been wandering around the halls at night, but something in his eyes stopped me, like he'd heard it all before, and nothing surprised him anymore. We got in the car, and as we pulled out of the parking lot, I took one last look at the motel. For a second, I could have sworn I saw someone standing in one of the windows, staring down at us. A flash of tangled hair, that same vacant smile. But when I blinked, it was gone. I still don't know who she was or what she wanted, but sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed, I swear I can still hear it. That slow, deliberate scratching against the door, and her voice whispering my name. It makes me wonder if maybe she's still out there somewhere, waiting, watching. I know, people think it's dangerous, or maybe even a bit reckless, but there's something about being out there in the wilderness, just me and the world. The calm of nature, the way the wind whispers through the leaves, and the occasional snap of a twig beneath my feet, it all feels so real, so alive. At least it usually does. The day I'm about to tell you about started out like any other hike. It was a cool Saturday morning, the air crisp enough to bite at my nose, but not enough to bother me. The sky was a pale blue, streaked with wisps of cloud, and I could see the sun just beginning to break through, casting long shadows across the trail. There was a path I'd been meaning to take for a while. One I'd heard was beautiful, but a bit off the beaten track. It was the perfect day to tackle it. I remember that trail being eerily quiet as I started up the mountain. Usually, I'd hear birds chirping or catch the rustle of some small creature scurrying away, but there was nothing that day. Just the sound of my footsteps, crunching against the gravel and dirt, and the occasional groan of a tree as the wind pressed against it. It didn't bother me at first. I was more focused on the steep incline, pushing myself up, feeling the burn in my legs as the path wound higher and higher. After about 2 hours of climbing, I came to a point where the path widened a bit, and that's when I saw him. There, maybe 100 feet ahead, was a man. He was standing right in the middle of the trail, facing away from me. I remember slowing my pace, instinctively trying to size him up. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like a worn-out flannel shirt and old jeans. His posture was strange, stiff, almost too rigid, like he was listening for something. He just stood there, unmoving, staring at the trees to his right. I called out, "Hey, everything all right?" I wasn't exactly expecting trouble, but it was odd to see someone standing still like that, especially out here, so far from any nearby trailheads. He didn't answer. He didn't even turn around. It was like he hadn't heard me at all. The weirdest part was I had this instant feeling, this unease, like the temperature had dropped just a little. A shiver crawled up my spine. I chalked it up to the wind picking up, or maybe just nerves, but the feeling was real. It was like the world had subtly changed, as if something was suddenly off balance. I tried again, a bit louder this time. "Hey, are you lost?" Still nothing. He didn't flinch, didn't move. His head was tilted just a bit to the side, like he was listening intently to something that I couldn't hear. I could see his hair, dark and a bit messy, moving slightly in the wind. The unease inside me grew. Something told me to walk away, just turn around and head back down the mountain, but my curiosity got the better of me. So I approached, taking slow, careful steps. The crunch of my boots was the only sound, and I half hoped that it would be enough to make him turn. When I was about 20 feet away, he moved. Not towards me, not in a way that acknowledged I was there. Instead, he raised his arm and pointed out into the thick forest to his right. "What are you pointing at?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He still didn't turn around, didn't say a word. His finger just hung in the air, pointing into the woods, and that's when I heard him mumble something. It was so quiet that I could barely make it out, a low whisper that seemed to merge with the rustling of the leaves. I stepped closer. "Sorry, what was that?" "They're in the trees," he said, almost to himself. His voice was raspy, like he hadn't used it in days. "You shouldn't be here." A chill settled into my bones, the kind that comes from something more than just cold air. It was fear, pure and simple. My instincts were screaming at me now, telling me to back away, to get out of there. But I stood frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The man was still pointing, but his arm had begun to tremble, just slightly. I could hear his breathing, shallow and rapid. Suddenly, without warning, he turned his head, and I swear I jumped. His eyes, God, his eyes were wide, so wide that it looked unnatural. There was this strange intensity in them, something that seemed almost vacant. He looked straight at me, and his mouth moved again, but this time no sound came out. Just a dry, hollow motion, like he was trying to speak but couldn't find the words. Then all at once, he let out a low, shuddering breath, dropped his arm, and started to walk into the woods. Just like that, as if our encounter had never happened. I stood there, my heart pounding in my ears, watching him disappear between the trees. I wanted to call after him, to ask if he needed help, but I couldn't get the words out. Something about the way he moved, the way he seemed to melt into the shadows of the forest, it made my skin crawl. And then I realized the forest was quiet again. Dead quiet. Not a single sound, no rustling leaves, no chirping birds. Just silence. I turned back to the trail, my eyes darting around, suddenly hyper-aware of everything. The cold air biting at my cheeks, the wind picking up, the way the shadows seemed to lengthen and twist. I decided then that I needed to get out of there. I started walking, quickly at first, then faster, almost jogging. The path seemed to stretch on forever, and the further I went, the darker it got. The sun had dipped behind the mountains, and an uneasy twilight settled in. I felt it again, that sense of something watching me, like eyes were following me from the trees. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that man again, standing there, pointing, but there was nothing. Just when I thought I might be getting close to where the trail leveled out, I heard something behind me. A rustling, like someone or something was moving through the underbrush. I stopped, holding my breath, straining to listen. It was faint, but definitely there. Footsteps, and they were getting closer. I turned and saw nothing. Just the empty trail winding back up the mountain. My hands were shaking now, my fingers cold and numb. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I could feel it, that unnatural silence pressing in, the weight of eyes I couldn't see. I took off, running now, not caring about the uneven ground, about the branches that whipped at my face. I just needed to get out. The footsteps behind me picked up, matching my pace, growing louder. I swear I could hear breathing, low and ragged, just behind me, just close enough that I could almost feel it on the back of my neck. I stumbled, nearly losing my balance, and that's when I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It was his voice. "You shouldn't be here." I pushed harder, my lungs burning, the cold air cutting into my throat. The trail twisted and turned, and I could barely see now, the darkness closing in. My mind was a blur of fear, every instinct screaming that I was running out of time, that if I didn't get off that mountain, something terrible was going to happen. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps stopped. I kept running, afraid to slow down, afraid to look back. I didn't stop until I saw the lights of the parking lot, until I could hear the distant hum of a car engine. Only then did I turn, gasping for breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The trail behind me was empty. No man, no footsteps, just the dark line of trees, standing silent and still. I made it to my car, my hands shaking so badly that I fumbled the keys twice before finally getting the door open. I got in, locked the doors, and just sat there for a moment, trying to calm myself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But I couldn't. Nothing about it made any sense. Who was that man? What was he doing out there, and why did he seem so wrong? I drove away, my eyes flicking constantly to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing there at the edge of the parking lot, watching me leave. But there was nothing. I haven't been back to that trail since. I still love hiking, but I stick to the crowded trails now, the ones where there are people around, where I can hear birds and see the sun filtering through the branches. But even then, sometimes I get that feeling again, that chill, that sense that something is watching. And I wonder if, somewhere in those woods, he's still out there, standing silently, pointing into the darkness, waiting for someone else to come along. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it again, that whisper, soft and distant, like it's coming from just beyond the walls of my room. You shouldn't be here. I know it sounds crazy, And I've tried telling myself that it was all just my imagination, that maybe it was a trick of the wind, or that I was just exhausted. But deep down, I know what I felt that day was real. The fear, the cold, the way the world seemed to shift around me. It wasn't just in my head. I've even tried looking up stories about that mountain, about strange encounters or people getting lost, but I haven't found anything that makes sense of it. Sometimes I think about that man, about the emptiness in his eyes, and I wonder if he was a warning, someone who saw something out there and never truly came back. It's hard to explain, but part of me feels like he was trapped, like he was trying to tell me to leave before it was too late, before whatever had a hold of him got to me too. And I listened. Thank God I listened. But I can't help but think about the people who might not. The ones who will see him on the trail, just standing there, pointing into the trees and won't take the hint to turn around. The world is full of strange things, things we can't understand or explain. I used to think that hiking was my way of getting close to nature, of finding peace. But now I know there are places out there, places that we're not meant to go, places where the rules are different, where something watches from the shadows, waiting for us to step out of line. And I can still see him, in my mind, standing in the middle of that trail, eyes wide, arm trembling, pointing into the woods as if he could see something that I couldn't. Something lurking just beyond the trees, in the darkness, waiting. I hope I never find out what it was, and I hope, for your sake, that you don't either. It all started as a harmless weekend getaway. You know, one of those spontaneous trips you take with friends because everyone just needs a break from life. There were 5 of us. Me, my girlfriend Emily, her best friend Kate, and 2 other friends, Matt and Brian. We were looking for adventure, something different than the usual. And, well, I guess you could say we found it. We had decided to head into the countryside for a camping trip. The idea was to get off the grid for a while, take in some fresh air, and escape from the stress of work and school. Matt had found this hidden gem online, a secluded forest a few hours from town, with trails and a supposedly great spot for stargazing. It sounded perfect. But things started going wrong pretty quickly. It was supposed to be an easy drive, but we ended up taking a wrong turn somewhere. The GPS was useless. Signal dropped out after we left the main highway, and before we knew it, we were driving down this winding dirt road with no signs, no lights, just dust and shadows. The trees on either side were dense, their branches twisting over the road like skeletal fingers. I could feel the mood in the car shift. The excitement faded, replaced by this growing unease. We had no idea where we were, and the road just seemed to stretch endlessly, leading us deeper and deeper into nowhere. It was getting dark. The kind of darkness that comes on fast in the countryside, where there's no city glow to soften the fall of night. The sky turned from a deep blue to an inky black, and soon our headlights were the only thing piercing the darkness. The road was narrow, barely wide enough for our SUV, and the trees loomed closer, their shadows growing taller, almost swallowing us. Emily was sitting beside me in the front seat, her hands gripping her phone, trying to get a signal. "I think we should just turn around," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. I nodded, but there wasn't really anywhere to turn. The road was too narrow, with thick underbrush on both sides. We had to keep going until we found a wider spot. That's when we saw it, a house up ahead. It seemed to appear out of nowhere, standing back from the road with an overgrown driveway. It was one of those old, weather-beaten places, like something straight out of a horror movie. 2 stories, windows dark and empty, the wood siding faded and cracked. The front porch sagged under its own weight, and the whole place seemed to lean, as if it had been forgotten by time. "We should ask for directions," Matt suggested from the back seat. There was hesitation in his voice, but at that point, none of us wanted to keep driving aimlessly through the dark. We pulled into the driveway, gravel crunching under the tires, and I killed the engine. The silence that followed was almost overwhelming, broken only by the sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. We all sat there for a moment, just staring at the house. It didn't feel right, but it also felt like our only option. Brian was the first to speak up. "All right, let's just go knock. We'll ask if they have a map or something." He was always the brave one in the group, always eager to take the lead. So we got out, the air immediately colder than it had felt in the car. I could hear the wind, a low moan as it pushed through the trees, and the creak of the house settling in the breeze. We made our way to the porch, the boards groaning under our weight. Emily was right beside me, her hands slipping into mine. I could feel her trembling, or maybe that was me. Brian knocked on the door, a loud echoing thud that seemed to linger in the stillness around us. We waited, exchanging uneasy glances. No answer. He knocked again, louder this time. After what felt like an eternity, we heard footsteps, slow, shuffling, like someone dragging their feet across a wooden floor. The door opened, just a crack, and a face appeared. It was an older man, his eyes sunken and his skin pale, almost gray in the dim light spilling from our flashlights. He stared at us for a moment, not saying a word, and I could feel the tension in the air grow thicker. Sorry to bother you, sir," Brian started, trying to sound polite. "We got a little lost, and we were hoping you could give us some directions." The man didn't respond right away. His eyes scanned over each of us, his gaze lingering a bit too long. Then, finally, he opened the door wider, stepping aside. "Come in," he said, his voice barely more than a raspy whisper. None of us wanted to go inside. It was instinct. Every part of me screamed that we should just turn around, get back in the car, and drive until we found our way out. But it felt like we didn't have a choice. The darkness outside, the isolation, we needed help. The inside of the house was worse than I imagined. It was dark, the only light coming from a single lamp in the corner of what looked like a living room. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, and there was a smell, something damp, moldy, mixed with something else, something metallic. My stomach turned, but I tried to ignore it. The man gestured for us to sit. There were a few old chairs scattered around, and an ancient couch with stuffing spilling out of one arm. None of us moved. Brian tried again, his voice a bit shakier now. We don't mean to intrude. We just need directions back to the main road." The man didn't answer. He just stared at us, his eyes unblinking. There was something off about him, something in the way he stood, almost too still, like he was waiting for something. The silence stretched on, and I could feel my heart pounding harder with every passing second. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, there was a noise, a soft thump, followed by what sounded like a muffled voice. Emily squeezed my hand, and I saw Kate glance towards the hallway that led away from the living room. The man's eyes flickered in that direction too, and for the first time I saw something change in his expression, something like annoyance or maybe fear. Is there someone else here?" Kate asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's gaze snapped back to us, and he shook his head, a jerky, unnatural movement. "No one," he said, his voice sharper now. "Just you, just guests." A chill ran down my spine. I looked at Emily, and I could see the fear in her eyes. We needed to leave. I could see that she knew it too. I cleared my throat, forcing a smile. "Actually, I think we should just get going. We don't want to bother you any longer." The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment he didn't move. Then he stepped closer, blocking the doorway. "No, it's late. You should stay," he said, his voice a low growl. My heart was racing now. I could feel the tension in the room crackling, like we were all on the edge of something terrible. I glanced back towards the hallway, and that's when I saw it, a face. Just for a second, peeking out from around the corner. It was gone before I could even react, but I knew I had seen it. Someone else was in this house. I felt Emily tug on my arm, her eyes wide with fear. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. Brian must have felt it too. He took a step back, trying to put some space between us and the man. "Thanks for your hospitality, but we really should be going," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. The man didn't move. His eyes darted to the hallway again, and I saw his jaw clench. Something was wrong. Something beyond just this man's strange behavior. I could feel it, this heavy, oppressive feeling pressing down on me, like we were standing on the edge of a cliff, and one wrong move would send us all tumbling into darkness. Then the noise came again, louder this time, a definite thud, followed by what sounded like a stifled cry. Kate gasped, and the man spun around, his expression twisted into something almost like panic. "Stay here," he snapped, and then he turned, disappearing down the hallway. That was it. The moment he was out of sight, I grabbed Emily's hand and nodded to the others. We need to go. Now. We moved quickly, quietly, backing towards the door. Matt reached it first, his hand fumbling with the lock, and I could feel my pulse in my throat, every muscle in my body tense as I listened for the sound of the man returning. Finally, the door creaked open and we spilled out onto the porch, the cold night air hitting us like a slap in the face. We didn't look back. We ran to the car, the gravel crunching beneath our feet, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. I could hear Emily crying, could hear the panic in every breath she took. Brian yanked the car door open, and we all piled in, slamming the doors behind us. The silence inside the car was deafening, filled only by our panicked breathing. Sam fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly that he dropped them onto the floor. He swore under his breath, and I leaned over to grab them, my fingers brushing against the cold metal as I handed them back. "Hurry up, Sam," Emily urged, her voice cracking. She was looking out the window, her eyes wide and terrified. I followed her gaze, my heart pounding. I expected to see the man, expected to see him standing there on the porch, his face twisted with anger or malice. But there was nothing, just the dark house, the door hanging open, the shadows moving with the wind. Finally, Sam got the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. He backed out of the driveway so fast that the tires spun in the gravel, sending a cloud of dust into the air. We pulled onto the road, and he floored it, the SUV rattling as we sped away, the old house growing smaller in the rearview mirror. No one spoke for a long time. The only sound was the engine, the tires humming against the dirt road, and Emily's quiet, shaky breaths as she tried to calm herself down. I reached over and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze, even though I wasn't sure if I was trying to comfort her or myself. "Did you guys see that?" Kate finally said, her voice barely audible. "That person, in the hallway?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure what I had seen. It had happened so quickly, a face, just a pale shape in the dark. But it was enough to tell me that we were not alone in that house. "There was definitely someone else in there," I said, my voice low. "And I don't think the man wanted us to know." Brian let out a shaky laugh. "Yeah, no kidding. I don't know what the hell was going on in there, but I'm glad we got out when we did." Sam kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "Let's just get as far away from here as we can," he muttered. The road seemed even longer on the way back, winding through the trees that swayed in the darkness. The headlights barely pierced the thick shadows, and it felt like we were driving through a tunnel of blackness, no end in sight. I kept glancing in the side mirrors, expecting to see headlights behind us, or maybe something worse. Maybe that man, or whoever else was in that house following us, chasing us down that endless road. After what felt like forever, the dirt road finally gave way to asphalt. The sight of the main road was like a breath of fresh air. We turned onto it, and for the first time since we had left that house, I started to feel a little bit of the tension ease. We were back on familiar ground, heading in the right direction. We were getting away. But just as I started to relax, Emily let out a gasp. What? What is that?" I turned to look at her, my heart lurching at the fear in her voice. She was staring out the window, her eyes wide. I followed her gaze, looking out into the trees, and my blood ran cold. There, standing just off the side of the road, was a figure, pale, motionless, watching us. It was the same person I'd seen in the hallway of that house, an emaciated face, eyes dark and empty, skin ghostly in the moonlight. And that's when I realized they were smiling. It was a wide, unnatural grin, their lips curling up in a way that made my stomach turn. "Go faster," I whispered, not taking my eyes off the figure. "Sam, just go faster." He didn't need to be told twice. He pressed down on the gas, and the car picked up speed, the tires humming louder as we left the figure behind. I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them running after us, but there was nothing, just the dark road disappearing behind us. It was almost dawn by the time we reached a small town. We found a diner that was just opening, the neon "open" sign flickering on as we pulled into the lot. None of us spoke as we got out of the car and walked inside, the bell above the door chiming softly. We took a booth in the corner, away from the windows, and sat down, the exhaustion hitting all at once. A waitress came over, her cheerful smile faltering when she saw our faces. You all okay? She asked, her voice tinged with concern. Brian managed a nod, though he didn't look up from the menu. Yeah, just a long night. She nodded slowly, giving us a sympathetic look before she left us alone. I stared down at the table, my hands still trembling slightly, the events of the night playing over and over in my head. The house, the man, the face in the hallway, and that figure by the road. What do you think they wanted? Kate asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, swallowing hard. I don't know, but whatever it wasn't good. Emily leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. She hadn't said much since we left, her eyes distant, lost in thought. I wrapped an arm around her, trying to give her some comfort, though I felt as shaken as she did. The waitress came back with coffee, and we all took it gratefully, the warmth helping to steady our nerves. The sun was just starting to rise, the first rays of light creeping in through the windows. It felt like we had made it through something terrible, like the light was finally washing away the darkness that had clung to us. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Not really. I could still see that face, that smile. I could still hear the sound of that man's voice, telling us to stay, telling us we were his guests. And I knew somehow that we had only barely escaped something much worse. It was a Tuesday night, and I remember it so clearly because it was the day everything changed. I had just gotten back from work late, exhausted after a long day at the office. It was one of those evenings where you just want to eat something simple, watch TV for a bit, and then pass out in bed. I had made a quick dinner, some scrambled eggs, toast, whatever was easy, and was curled up on the couch, watching reruns of some sitcom that I wasn't even paying attention to. I guess it was around midnight when I decided to call it a night. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet you get used to when you live alone. I remember switching off the TV, and for a moment, just standing there, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the faint creak of the old floorboards settling. Everything seemed normal. I went through my usual nighttime routine, checking the locks, making sure the front door was secure, peeking through the blinds just out of habit. That's when I saw him for the first time. He was standing on the sidewalk, just outside my house. A man in a yellow jacket. He wasn't moving, just standing there, looking directly at my front door. His face was in shadow, and there was something about the way he stood so still that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that he was probably just some guy passing through, maybe waiting for a ride. But it felt wrong. There was something about him that just didn't fit. I let the blinds fall back into place, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I double-checked the lock on the front door, then turned off the lights and headed upstairs to my bedroom. I tried to shake the feeling, tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't get that image out of my head, him just standing there, watching. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rustling through the trees outside. The quiet that I usually loved about my neighborhood now felt oppressive, like the silence was hiding something. I rolled over, trying to get comfortable, but I couldn't shake the unease. A sudden noise made me sit up in bed, a faint tapping sound coming from downstairs. It was soft, barely there, but in the silence of the night, it was unmistakable. My stomach twisted, and I held my breath, straining my ears, trying to figure out if it was real or just my imagination. There it was again. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the front door. I slipped out of bed, my heart pounding, my bare feet making no sound on the carpet as I moved towards the top of the stairs. I leaned over the banister, peering down into the darkness of the living room. The tapping continued, steady, deliberate. I swallowed hard, feeling my mouth go dry. My phone was still in the bedroom, and I cursed myself for not bringing it with me. Slowly, I crept down the stairs, the wood creaking under my weight. I could see the outline of the front door, the faint glow from the streetlight outside filtering through the small window at the top. I reached the bottom of the stairs and paused, my hand hovering over the light switch. I wasn't sure if I wanted to see what was out there. Part of me wanted to pretend I hadn't heard anything, just go back to bed and forget it. But I knew I couldn't. My fingers found the switch, and I flicked on the light. The sudden brightness flooded the room, and I took a deep breath, stepping towards the door. The tapping had stopped. I reached the door and looked through the peephole, my heart thundering in my chest. He was still there. The man in the yellow jacket. He was closer now, standing right on my porch, his face just inches from the door. I could see him more clearly. His skin was pale, his eyes dark, almost hollow-looking. He wasn't moving, just staring at the door, as if he knew I was looking at him. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, my hand flying to the lock to make sure it was secure. I turned the deadbolt, even though I knew it was already locked. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. What did he want? Why was he here? Suddenly I heard something else, a rustling sound, coming from the side of the house. I turned, my eyes darting to the living room window. I moved slowly towards it, my hands shaking as I pulled the curtain aside just enough to peek through. There were more of them. 3 more figures, standing in the yard, all wearing yellow jackets. They were spaced out, one near the fence, another by the garage, and one standing near the side window. They were all facing the house, all completely still. My breath caught in my throat, and I let the curtain fall back, my mind reeling. This wasn't random. They were here for a reason. I ran back upstairs, my feet barely touching the steps, and grabbed my phone from the nightstand. My hands were trembling as I dialed 911, pressing the phone to my ear, my eyes darting around the dark room. It rang once, twice, then a voice answered. 911, what's your emergency? I tried to keep my voice steady, but it came out shaky, panicked. There are people outside my house, I whispered. They're trying to get in. The dispatcher's voice was calm, too calm, asking for my address, asking if the doors were locked. I gave her the information, my eyes glued to the bedroom window. I could see the front yard from here, see the man still standing on the porch, his face turned up as if he was looking directly at me. The police are on their way, the dispatcher said, her voice steady. Stay on the line with me. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I backed away from the window, crouching down beside the bed, trying to make myself as small as possible. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. The dispatcher kept talking, telling me to stay calm, telling me help was coming. Then suddenly, there was a loud bang from downstairs. My heart leapt into my throat, and I bit back a scream. It sounded like something, or someone, had slammed against the door. The man in the yellow jacket was trying to break in. I could hear the wood creaking, the door rattling in its frame. They're trying to get in, I whispered into the phone, my voice shaking. Stay calm, the dispatcher said. The police are almost there. Do you have somewhere you can hide? I looked around the room, my eyes landing on the closet. I scrambled towards it, pulling the door open and slipping inside, closing it just enough to leave a crack so I could see out. I could still hear the banging, louder now, more insistent. The whole house seemed to shudder with each impact. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the banging stopped. Silence fell over the house, heavy and oppressive. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, footsteps, voices, anything at all. The quiet was worse than the noise. It was like the whole world had stopped, waiting. A flash of blue and red lights suddenly lit up the room, spilling through the window. I heard the distant sound of a siren, growing louder, and I felt a surge of relief so intense it almost made me dizzy. The police were here. I stayed in the closet, listening as the sirens grew louder, as car doors slammed and voices called out. I heard footsteps on the porch, heard someone pounding on the door, not the violent banging from before, but a controlled, deliberate knock. This is the police. Is anyone inside? I pushed the closet door open, my legs trembling as I stood. I ran to the window, peering out to see 2 officers on the porch, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. I ran downstairs, my hands still shaking as I unlocked the door, pulling it open. The officers looked at me, their faces calm but serious. Are you all right, ma'am? One of them asked. I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. They were trying to get in. There were 4 of them. They were all wearing yellow jackets. The officers exchanged a glance, then one of them nodded. We're going to take a look around. Stay here. They moved off the porch, their flashlights sweeping across the yard, and I watched from the doorway, my heart still pounding. I could see their beams of light moving through the darkness, see them checking the side of the house, the garage, the fence. But there was nothing. No sign of the men. It was like they had vanished. One of the officers came back, shaking his head. "We didn't find anyone, ma'am," he said, his expression sympathetic but skeptical. "We checked the yard, the sides of the house, and even the nearby streets. There's no one here." I stared at him, my mind reeling. "But I saw them," I insisted, my voice cracking. "They were here. They were banging on the door. They were all around the house." The officer nodded, his eyes softening a bit. "I believe you," he said, though there was something in his tone that suggested he didn't really mean it. "We're going to stay around the area for a while, do some extra patrols, just to make sure everything's okay." I wanted to scream at him, to make him understand that this wasn't just a figment of my imagination, that what I saw was real. But I was too exhausted. My body felt like it had been through a war. I nodded numbly, wrapping my arms around myself as if that could somehow keep me together. "Is there anyone you can call?" the officer asked. "Someone who can stay with you tonight?" I hesitated, then nodded again. My sister lived about an hour away. I knew she would come if I called. The officer gave me a reassuring smile and handed me a card with his contact information. "Call if you see anything else. We'll be nearby." I watched as they walked back to their cruiser, the blue and red lights flashing one last time before they pulled away, disappearing down the street. The silence that followed was overwhelming. I closed the door, locking it, checking it again, even though I knew it was secure. My hands were still trembling, and my throat felt tight as I tried to breathe. I went to the living room, sinking down onto the couch, my phone clutched in my hand. I called my sister, my voice barely holding together as I explained what had happened. She didn't even hesitate. She said she'd be on her way right away. While I waited, I couldn't stop myself from getting up and checking the windows again. Every creak of the house made me jump. I felt like those eyes were still on me, even though I couldn't see anyone outside. The man in the yellow jacket, those empty eyes, that strange, deliberate way they all just stood there. It was burned into my mind. It must have been about an hour later when my sister arrived. She knocked on the door, calling my name softly, and I rushed to let her in. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug, her presence instantly making me feel a little safer, a little less alone. "I'm here now," she whispered, her voice comforting. "You're okay, I promise." We sat together in the living room for a long time, her arm around my shoulders while I told her everything that had happened. The men, the banging, how they just seemed to vanish when the police arrived. She listened, her face growing more serious with every word, and I could tell she believed me. That was what I needed most in that moment, someone to believe that what I had seen was real. She stayed the night, sleeping on the couch while I tried to sleep in my room. But every little noise made me sit up in bed, my heart racing. The wind outside, the branches scraping against the window. It all sounded like footsteps, like whispers. I barely slept, my eyes glued to the door, waiting for the handle to start turning, waiting for the banging to start again. The next morning, the light of day made everything feel a little less terrifying. The neighborhood looked normal again, quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where nothing like this should ever happen. My sister made coffee, and we sat at the kitchen table, the warmth of the mug in my hands, the only thing keeping me from feeling like I was going to shatter. "I think you should stay at my place for a few days," she said finally, her eyes searching mine. "Just until you feel better, until you're ready to come back." I wanted to argue, to say that this was my home, that I shouldn't have to leave because of some men in yellow jackets. But the truth was I was scared. I was terrified to be here alone, terrified that they would come back. I nodded, swallowing hard. We packed a bag for me, just enough clothes for a few days, and I followed her out to her car. I locked the door behind me, my eyes lingering on the house for a moment. It looked so normal in the daylight, the kind of place where nothing should ever go wrong. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over, that those men would be back, that they were waiting, somewhere out there, just beyond the edge of my vision. I could still see them in my mind, their yellow jackets, the way they stood so still, so deliberate. And that look in their eyes, that empty, hollow look that seemed to see right through me. My sister tried to cheer me up during the drive, talking about her plans for the week, about how we could spend some time together, maybe go out and do something fun to take my mind off things. I tried to smile, to nod along, but my mind kept drifting back to that night, to the feeling of standing at the top of the stairs, hearing the tapping on the door, knowing that someone was out there. For the next few days, I stayed with my sister. I tried to pretend everything was normal, tried to forget about what had happened. But every night, when the sun went down and the shadows started to stretch across the walls, I felt that fear creeping back in. I kept imagining them, standing outside, waiting, their faces hidden in shadow. It was on the third night at my sister's place when I woke up suddenly. The room was dark, the house quiet. I wasn't sure what had woken me, but there was this feeling, this sense that something was wrong. I sat up in bed, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, and that's when I heard it. A faint tapping. My heart stopped, my breath caught in my throat. The tapping was coming from the window. I turned my head slowly, my eyes widening as I saw it. A shadow just outside the glass, a figure standing there, their face hidden in the dark. And then as they moved closer, I saw it. The yellow jacket, glowing faintly in the moonlight. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, and I knew it was them. They had found me. The next thing I knew, I was screaming. My sister burst into the room, her face pale with fear, and she rushed to the window, throwing open the curtain. But there was nothing there. The yard was empty, the street beyond quiet and still. She turned to me, her eyes wide. "What did you see?" she whispered. I could barely speak, my whole body shaking. "He was there," I managed to say. "The man in the yellow jacket. He found me." We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We stayed in the living room, the lights on, my sister's arm around me as she tried to calm me down. But I knew what I had seen. It wasn't just in my head. He was there. They were there. We called the police again, but there was nothing they could do. No evidence, no sign of anyone. They said it was probably just a bad dream, maybe the stress of what had happened making me imagine things. But I knew better. Even now, months later, I still see them sometimes. Just out of the corner of my eye, a flash of yellow, a figure standing too still, too quiet. I moved out of that house, left the neighborhood behind, but I can't shake the feeling that they're still following me, that they're waiting for something. Every night, I check the windows, the doors, make sure everything is locked. But it doesn't matter, because I know, deep down, that locks won't keep them out. They're still out there somewhere, waiting for the right moment, and I have no idea what they want.